Hi, everybody. Happy Tuesday. I had some things that were swirling in my heart today, but mostly while I was in the dental chair today. You can see my pearly whites. And I wanted to share a little bit. So I'm going to read just a quick excerpt from Thomas Merton, New Seeds of Contemplation. This is the one book other than my sacred text that never leaves my my bedside table or my wherever I'm having my coffee and quiet time. This book is with me pretty much always. Um, so I'm just going to read a little bit from chapter 6, Pray for Your Own Discovery. It's a pity that the beautiful Christian metaphor of salvation has come to be so hackneyed and therefore so despised. It has been turned into a vapid synonym for piety, not even a truly ethical concept. Salvation is something far beyond ethical propriety. The word connotes a deep respect for the fundamental metaphysical reality of man. It reflects God's own infinite concern for man, God's love and care for man's inmost being, God's love for all that is his own in man, his son. It is not only human nature that is saved by the divine mercy, but above all the human person. The object of salvation is that which is unique, irreplaceable, incommunicable, that which is myself alone. This true inner sea must be drawn up like a jewel from the bottom of the sea, rescued from confusion, from indistinction, from immersion in the common, the nondescript, the trivial, the sordid, and the evanescent. We must be saved from immersion in the sea of lies and passions which is called the world. And we must be saved above all from that abyss of confusion and absurdity which is our own worldly self. The person must be rescued from the individual. The free Son of God must be saved from the conformist slave of fantasy, passion, and convention. The creative and mysterious inner self must be delivered from the wasteful, hedonistic, and destructive ego that seeks only to cover itself with disguises. To be lost is to be left to the arbitrariness and pretenses of the contingent ego, the smoke self that must inevitably vanish. To be saved is to return to one's inviolate and eternal reality and to live in God. Okay. I could keep going because it's so good. It just gets like better and better and better. But this little nugget that I wanted to draw on, Thomas Merton has a lot of teachings and a lot of beautiful work on like the true self versus the false self, and what's the ego and what's the divine voice inside you. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about today is this idea of spiritual bypassing. And I think spiritual bypassing has gotten a bad rap because it is a kind of fantasy. It's like a kind of denial that a lot of people can live into. And so when I'm talking about spiritual bypassing, I'm talking about people that deny the reality of what is in order to look at what could be. And I think it's really easy to put those people down because it's dismissive of what's actually happening, but rather than see the beautiful heart and the beautiful intention and maybe the lack of integrated grief of what reality holds, or or people's capacity isn't able to hold the reality of what is, and so they're just kind of focused on what could be. And so if you look at most sacred texts, specifically the Bible, there's going to be this tension between justice and mercy. And so what I think what we're seeing right now, as far as like the bigger social conversations, is this playing out between the ideals of justice and mercy. And what you have is, I would say, a group of people that's so focused on justice because justice has been kind of out of a sense of mercy, prioritizing mercy, justice has been left behind. And so there's this lack of reality inside that conversation. But then on the other side, you have people who are so focused on mercy that they can't integrate justice because that would feel unkind. And so that's why you have all those people that have obsession with empathy and compassion without the a good tethering in reality. So you have two groups of people that are focused on the highest ideal. And so you could say almost like a 5D kind of consciousness idea. But they're skipping the 3D in order to get to the 5D. So you've got all these people who are like, oh, just be kind, just love, just do this. And it's leaving behind all of these other people who are very anchored in what's happening right now. And they're not able to connect to that higher ideal. But when you've got all these other people who are so connected to this ideal that they're missing what's happening in reality. And so I think what's happening is like this massive movement of these two things slamming together, because in reality you need both, and you need to be holding both in tension at all times. Because I think a lot of people forget that, especially if you're working with like any of the more Eastern traditions, you kind of always have to start at the root and then bring everything up in order to get to those like higher levels of consciousness. Like you have to start deeply in the body, in the history, that would be your root chakra up into your sacral, and then moving up. And so, trying to get right into like a spiritual zone and talk about things from spiritual perspectives, you skip the reality of what's happening. But there are a lot of people that are so rooted in what's happening that they can't quite get altitude over it. They can't quite get leverage in order to see up and over it, because it's been so pushed to the side, that they're holding on to that and they can't let go. And so it creates this like really intense tension between groups. But I think also we're seeing this as far as like culture wide in the West, but also inside people, like inside family units, and generational conversations. And people are, there's that idealistic, young people conversation of like, oh, the world could just be like this. And then other, generations are like, no, you don't have a good tethering on reality. And so I want to introduce these two kind of concepts. So Thomas Sowell, whether you love him or don't like his work, he introduces this concept where he's talking about how people see the world. And it's like these two viewpoints. And you could say it's like 3D or 5D, but you could also look at it from terms of like, he's talking about like the reality of human behavior. And so you've got a group of people that will look at the reality of human behavior. Let's say somebody who like leans more conservative, and they're going to look at the reality of human behavior and say, okay, so this is what always happens. So we need to make space for this inside our society. So like inside our criminal justice system, inside our management, inside our businesses, inside how we organize the world, we need to make space for the fact that there's darkness inside of people. And then you have all of these other people who are like, oh, but people are kind of like more of that blank slate. Like we can just manage and educate people out of their own darkness or out of their own proclivity for like sin or bad behavior or what have you. Like you just need to manage people well, give them the right tools, and they won't do that anymore. When the reality is obviously somewhere in between, right? Like there is the banality to evil. There is darkness that exists that we sometimes need to, like, you just can't make sense of because it doesn't make sense in a perfectly ordered, rightly ordered, beautiful world. And, we live in a fallen world. And so, there's some people that are like, okay, so it's just fallen. It just is. So we're just going to move along with this understanding. And then there's all these other people who are they really believe like, oh, we can educate and fund and, throw money at this and energy and time and nurture it. And people will just suddenly stop having these, this bad behavior. Everything will go perfectly. And so you're having these clashes of ideas. And so it's a fundamental worldview problem. And so when you've got people that believe these things, everything will then funnel out from there. That will be, political and beyond. And so but it starts there. It's like, what do you fundamentally believe about the world? Do you believe the world can be saved, or do you believe that the world is fallen and we just have to make do with what is? And so I'm like looking at the extraordinary reactions that people are having to what's going on lately. It seems almost like, you hear people using the word like mind virus, because it seems a little bit like that. Like people are acting so far out of what their, normal character would be. And so, I think some of this is also the content that we're taking in. And so if you're seeing a lot of people in like a hyper vigilant state of behavior. And so it's almost like you're interacting with people at their most irrational, because you're almost like working with people who are in a sense like almost like if I'm in like my full mama bear mode, right? Like I've got my baby and something's threatening my baby. But let's say our country is my baby, or this group of people is my baby, and I'm on high alert. I'm not only going to be reacting irrationally, I'm not even going to be able to see the humanity in the enemy. It's just the enemy. And so realizing like there's a lot of content and things that we're taking in, like a lot of language is going on that is making people like, their people are turning up the heat. Content creators, news, all these things are turning up the heat so that people are in their most hyper vigilant. And so you could say it's a mind virus, or you can say this is just how the body's intended to work. And you're putting people into a state of their most intense by threatening what they hold most dear and saying that this other person is a threat. And so you're looking at, like, I was listening to a story yesterday about a woman who had a traumatic birth at the hospital, and she happened to lean more conservative, and she was somebody who spoke publicly about her not approving of abortion, and getting an anonymous call from the nurses at the hospital threatening her and saying horrible, just like absolutely horrible things, because in their mind, because of the content that they've taken in, this woman represents an enemy that is so dangerous that by whatever means necessary, you're able to attack that person. It's almost like when you hear the stories of like, the resistance, the French resistance and things like that, like through World War II, this is kind of how people are operating. It's like, by any means necessary, we have to take them down. And so when you're using language or you're speaking language, of people as literal Nazis and literally Hitler and literally this, it creates this, it's putting people into a state of hypervigilance, and that goes on both sides. And so when you're talking about, immigrants as, a danger, they're threatening your family, they're doing all these things, that it puts people into a state of hypervigilance where it would then make sense. It's the natural conclusion that they would be that protective. And so it's really interesting when you look at cultures that are a little bit more collectivist, where they don't have, like look at Japan, for instance, they have very tight borders. They have extremely tight borders. And so they don't have any kind of problem understanding why you would close a border, right? Because they've got like really tight boundaries around themselves, their culture, their people. But then they have huge asks of their people, right? So like, they are much more willing to like do masks and things like that, because in order to save the whole, they'll kind of do whatever that takes. And so what you see right now is these two different ideals that are slamming up against each other. And, we've been seeing this since COVID, and, it's bringing out people in their most desperation. And I know I talked about this last week, that this is like, very challenging time to be alive. This is also the best time to be alive if you want to do some work, if you want to look at yourself and like, how do I operate when I am threatened, and when my family is threatened, and when my culture is threatened, and what does that look like? And so, just like taking in that level of, okay, dropping in, looking at somebody and just saying, okay, so if I'm interacting with somebody right now who believes like they are in a state of a frenzy because they feel so hyper activated. And so you're not talking to somebody who is like doing well. Like, like this is not a wellness conversation. This is like how would I interact with this person? Almost like a loving mother who's interacting with a child who is like just absolutely frantic. And you would sit, like you wouldn't scream at them, but you also wouldn't like chastise them either. It would be like, okay, let's sit down. Okay, how can we bring this down a notch? Because you're not, they're manic. And when you're interacting with somebody who feels so protective of everything that they hold dear, you become more understanding of where they're at. So looking at this within yourself and like, okay, so where's the little plateau where I lose my humanity? This is where you get to kind of walk right up to that edge and kind of pull yourself back, which is, okay, so let's say I'm at home and I'm, watching content that feels really terrifying. And so then, I see somebody attacking, an ICE agent. And And that feels a little bit good to me. I'm like, oh yeah, they got theirs. Okay. That to me, that's a flag. That's a flag that I have now lost my humanity, because if I was standing at home and I was in a good spot and somebody, that agent got dropped off at my front door, and I'm standing there with a first aid kit and I wouldn't move towards them in order to help them, that's saying something to me about my own humanity. And in the same breath, if I had somebody that was on the opposite side of this conversation and they got dropped off at my house and they needed immediate medical care, and I had all those tools in my hand and I wouldn't move towards them, that's something for me to look at. So it's really about engaging the body, engaging where your body's actually at. Like, what's the 3D reality of the world that we are living in right now, instead of just focusing on these ideas of like, oh, just like love and just kindness and just this. It's like, it's not that. And by just saying that it is, you're denying the reality of millions of people on both sides who are feeling very frantic about this. So it's more about like, how do you enter so deeply into the 3D experience that people are having that you can then help them calm down and move into maybe a little bit more of like a higher altitude around it, to be like, you don't actually want someone to die. And then they're like, no, I actually don't. But it's, if you are trying to meet people up here when they're down here wildly, manically in their bodies, you're going to lose each other. You're going to miss. And so it's really about going so deeply into like, what are you afraid of? Tell me what you're afraid of. Let's talk about the fear. Let's be here. Like, let's talk about the threat that you're feeling. And then you can watch people kind of like, oh yeah, okay. And then you can kind of move them up into a higher ideal of like, okay, let's talk about unity. Let's talk about freedom. Let's talk about liberty. Let's talk about boundaries. Let's talk about, what would a middle ground feel like? How do you, what is the juicy middle between this, and what do you do with all those feelings that you're feeling, and just meeting people there. So that's all I have for today. I have a ton of homework to do, so I'm gonna go, but yeah, I hope everybody has a great day.